Good evening and welcome to the Andrea Kaye Show. While I fit those demographics and that description, my name is Wendy Patrick. I am a good friend of Andrea's and I'm going to be guesting tonight. I am also, by the way, the host of a show that airs at the same time tomorrow night live with Dr. Wendy. I am an attorney, patriot, and PhD with a passion for people and a penchant for politics. So let's dive right into the evening stories. First, sports are back. However, these are not the same sports you probably remember growing up. In fact, sports opening games this week have looked markedly different than we remember. I mean, remember those summer times, sitting in the stands, singing "Take Me Out to the Ball Game," smashing peanuts under our seats, doing all the sorts of things that made sports that haven, that break from politics. Well, no longer. Sports are truly a good old-fashioned American pastime as of this week. Now, what did we see when we had the opening games this time? Well, first of all, if you were watching, you were not watching from the stands, you were watching from the comfort of your own home, probably thinking that you were going to take a little bit of a break from COVID-19. But depending on which game you watched, one of the first things you probably saw was Dr. Fauci completely decked out, taking the mound to throw the first pitch. Yes, I'm talking about the same Dr. Fauci, the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. Now, he was the headline yesterday, and not because he gave another coronavirus briefing. He was the most famous person, probably, at least briefly, on the field before Thursday night's opening game between the New York Yankees and the Washington Nationals. He has made no secret of his baseball fandom, especially for the Washington Nationals. So maybe it's not a surprise that he was picked to throw out the first pitch of the delayed season. And by the way, what a pitch it was. If you haven't seen it, you got to go to YouTube and see this pitch. Good thing he's not on the team. But he took the field. He was wearing a Nats jersey, he was wearing a cap, and he really tossed a wild one. Now, I'm sure he'd like a do-over, but he would probably also make the joke that there were at least nobody in the stands, no fans to see it live. But God bless him, he's probably been advised since then not to quit his day job. But some of you might argue with that analysis too, because although he wore a mask for the pitch like he is supposed to, he was photographed and videotaped not wearing one later in the stands, which of course was another headline all over social media. So he sort of stole the show from the baseball game, I guess. And by the way, he does say he was dehydrated. So just to give you both sides, that was his excuse. However, that particular game made headlines for another reason as well. Every player and coach from the Washington Nationals and the Yankees kneeled ahead of that game. It was something to behold if you watch that footage. And it was a big surprise to many people. They expected sports to start to take everybody's mind off of politics and protests and COVID-19 and all of the things that have really cast a cloud over the summertime thus far. But instead, it was more of a racial dialogue, the dialogue about racial injustice. It made its way onto the field, and many people were surprised when they actually thought that that was going to be the politics-free zone that they grew up with. Now, that game, that they weren't alone. There were players from other teams that took a knee as well. In fact, most members of the San Francisco Giants took a knee during a moment of silence prior to an opening game against the Los Angeles Dodgers, except for one man. San Francisco Giants pitcher Sam Coonrod was the only player to stand during a moment that honored the Black Lives Matter movement ahead of the opener. And by the way, why? He was very transparent about his faith. He explained to reporters after the game that as a Christian, he can't kneel before anything besides God. Now, the president weighed in as well. And you know, the president, he is also scheduled to toss a pitch in August. Now, I hope he has better aim than Dr. Fauci. But he had something to say about the old-fashioned pastime that he watched as well. He basically said what you might expect, that he wants players to stand for the flag. He wants them to stand during the national anthem. He's also going to, by the way, be throwing a pitch at a Yankees game, and had something to say about what he saw on the field as well. So he's actually threatening not to participate. You know, he may go back and forth on this if players don't start standing for the game. And by the way, just in case you were wondering, the team manager respected Coonrod's decision to stand. This is mirroring the same kind of debate that we remember seeing on the sporting field back in the Colin Kaepernick days. In fact, back then, he was the outlier taking a knee. And back then, there was this really divisive debate about whether or not sports and the sporting field should be a place for politics or whether it should be a place to play ball. And that's the kind of thing we're seeing discussed today, but the pendulum clearly has swung. In fact, one of the things that the team manager, Gabe Kapler, said is the one thing that we said we're going to let people do, i.e. the players, is express themselves. And that means if Coonrod wants to stand to express his Christian faith and his allegiance to God, that is being respected as well. Players are having choices, and we've seen those choices taking place in real time. Now, it seems like yesterday, for those of you that remember how far we've come from 2017. Remember October 8th, 2017, when Mike Pence walked out of a game after having flown across the country. He basically took a stand when players took a knee. Now, I suppose if everybody walked out like Pence did, it would have an impact on that game, but we can't say that nowadays because there are no fans in the stands. But the point remains the same. It is very important that maybe, depending on what side you're on, we decide whether or not sports is going to remain about the game or whether sports is going to be about politics. Coaches, by the way, they've really switched it up here as well. Remember back in the day, 2017 seems like so long ago, they were basically saying we want our players to stand. Now, of course, there is a newfound respect for people being able to both play ball and play politics, is the way the argument goes. So we'll have to see what the president decides to do, because remember, August 15th, where he is scheduled to throw the first pitch at that Yankees game, that's going to be here before you know it. And what everybody's going to be watching between now and then is whether or not players decide to make these games more about the games. All right. Now, I suppose we're also going to be watching to make sure they don't get sick and they stay healthy because, of course, having Dr. Fauci on there tonight, or last night, I should say, also refocused us on the fact that it is still dangerous. They won't be live. We're still going to be watching, and there's still a lot to talk about. All right. So that is sort of a preview of what your summer holds for you. We hope you stay with us. We've got a great guest coming up after this first break. Again, you're listening to the Andrea Kaye Show. My name is Wendy Patrick. I'm filling in tonight. We will be back in just a few minutes. Stay with us. Good evening and welcome back to the Andrea Kaye Show. I am Wendy Patrick, filling in for my good friend Andrea Kaye. Well, we were just talking about baseball, the all-American pastime, and I'm going to get into that a little bit more with my next guest. I'm delighted to be joined by James Herschen. James, like me, is a lawyer. He's also an MA in media psychology. How do you like that? Boy, who would have thought that would become as popular as it is today? He's also a New York Times bestselling author. He's an international business lawyer, a news analyst, cultural commentator. And I also learned he was the keyboardist for the Temptations. My goodness, is there anything you don't do, James? JamesHerschen.com is where you can find out more about him. But James, welcome to the show. Good evening and welcome back to the Andrea Kaye Show. My name is Wendy Patrick. I am filling in for the dynamite in a dress good friend of mine, Andrea Kaye. Welcome back to the second half of the show. Well, so we've gone from sports to protests to schools. I am delighted to be joined by Bob Walters, who is our official education contributor here on the Andrea Kaye Show. He's also the author of Facing Reality in American Education. And I'm really glad that he's here because we're already talking about going back to school. although it's not quite going to look like the going back to school we remember growing up. Is that fair to the kids? Is it fun for the kids? Is it even healthy for the kids? Now, hopefully, we're going to have all those questions answered. Welcome, Bob. Thank you, Bob. Well, we are just dying to hear what you have to say on this topic because I don't know about the rest of our listeners, but I feel like the authorities have just been going back and forth on this the entire summer. First, it was virtual just till May. Then it was just till June. Then we were all coming back in the fall. Then we weren't coming back in the fall. Now it's hybrid. And then as of today, we're hearing more from physicians saying, well, wait a minute, the kids are not really the age group that get COVID, but what happens if they pick it up and they bring it back to mom and dad or grandpa and grandma? What's the latest statistics wise as to what we're going to do in the fall here, Bob? Well, Bob, those two studies are very interesting to talk about in combination. So, on the one hand, we all know, I mean, this is probably common sense that kids need socialization and to take them out of that environment and they miss their friends. Remember what it was like to be a teen or a preteen. I mean, we as adults, we forget that how important a peer group is at that precious young age. So already we can't simply say, oh, but there's Zoom, there's texting. It's just not the same. But I am particularly, my interest is piqued by that second study because don't we have friends and colleagues that are basically saying, look, I'm being forced to telework and I'm being forced to homeschool. I cannot keep all those balls in the air. How are those parents that are doing double duty around the clock, raising kids, homeschooling kids, and then somehow doing their regular job remotely? How are they going to survive this? You know, it also brings up this topic of dangerous kids, and we worry about kids having the access to the help that they need. Sometimes troubled kids need pro social solutions. And if, in fact, as that first study you mentioned, they're being anxious, they are feeling isolated, they are maybe ruminating on negative emotions, nursing grievances, all the kinds of things we worry about. How will another semester at home, another semester where they don't have the access maybe they otherwise would to somebody noticing them acting out, giving them help, maybe having access to mental health support, how will that impact kids who sadly are already troubled? How do you actually enforce that? How do you enforce that? I know that, my night job is teaching college and there's the, kids have to keep their cameras on. We don't even call them kids, the students, because we have all ages. How do students actually abide by that? Or maybe a better question is, how do schools enforce remote learning from so far away? I mean, is it left up to the parents who are probably multitasking, teleworking at the same time? How do they then make sure that the kids are learning if it's all done remotely? Welcome back to the Andrea Kaye Show. My name is Wendy Patrick. I am filling in for my good friend AK. And we are still here with Bob Walters, who is our official education contributor and the author of Facing Reality in American Education. So, Bob, I teased this up before the break. We talked about procedure and how do kids learn? How do parents multitask? Cameras on or off? How do they take tests? How do they make friends when they're at home with their parents? But most of all, and of paramount concern to many parents, what are they learning? I think you and I both grew up in an era where we had math and we had history and we had homeroom and science. I mean, though we had wholesome subjects. That was exactly what I was going to ask you is the money tied to the curriculum? And I know that there are so many parents across the nation that have their own ideas about what they would like their kids to be learning. And sometimes they are just absolutely shocked and amazed when the kids come home from school what they've learned. So now that the kids will be home in school, how will they, if they will they have any more, I suppose, oversight, but that's only like literal oversight, looking over their children's shoulder. Will they have any control over this type of curriculum if in fact they are being used, if they're using vouchers to pay for the education because they wouldn't otherwise be able to afford it? A lot of our listeners are probably listening to this and thinking, what is actually involved in homeschooling? And, you know, you need something done, ask a busy person. So even people that are busy teleworking, they still care so deeply about what their children are learning. And if they thought they could juggle it, they would probably jump at the chance to offer homeschooling. I mean, what sort of resources are there for parents that might be listening that would love to be able to figure out how they can teach wholesome curriculum to their kids instead of navigate through what sounds like is a minefield that may be involved in online teaching? And even given that there's not even that many hours available, what might they do to see how maybe they can do it better themselves? Oh, that is such wonderful news that, because you're right. That is one of the things that we miss. I mean, when we think about being in grade school and high school, we don't just think about classroom learning. It's about the football field. It's about the quad and socializing with friends and the after school events and sports and trying out for teams. I made the joke earlier. We had math and history and science. Remember, we also had PE. Remember that? I mean, what do kids do nowadays for PE? Tell me more about this program that's available where kids actually can socialize during sports. Yeah, no, that's a blessing. And I mean, we remember that growing up. We remember learning about history. And I know that parents and kids are still interested in that. In fact, that's probably one of the things that has bipartisan support, that history is important. I know there's different ideas as to what statues we leave up and down and all the rest of that, which was the topic of a whole other segment. But history itself, what's the saying? If we don't learn from it, we're destined to repeat it. So I'm glad to hear that there actually are these options. And they also sound, Bob, like they are doable options as well. And that's probably the silver lining to this whole story, because busy parents want an option that they can actually take advantage of, even if they are still working. So, Bob, I got to leave it there, but I want to thank you so much for joining the show. Again, Bob Walters, he's our education contributor. He's the author of Facing Reality in American Education. Do you want to shout out a website real fast before I let you go? Excellent. Bob, thank you so much for just this great information. Optimistic, inspiring, encouraging. Thank you for joining the show. You have been listening to the Andrea Kaye Show. Thank you so much for spending a Friday night with us tonight. My name is Wendy Patrick. I've been filling in for AK, who will be back in action next week. But I want to thank you so much for joining us. Stay safe, stay healthy, and God bless you.